The wind came first. It did not announce itself the way wind does in open country, a broad, sighing pressure across a flat plain. Here in Canyon Frostfall, it arrived as something meaner, something with an edge to it. It threaded through the narrow throat of rock, like a blade being drawn slow from a sheath, and the sound it made was not wind at all. It was closer to a voice, low, old, carrying no message anyone wanted to hear. Corporal Leah Weston heard it. She lay motionless on a ledge of granite no wider than a kitchen table, 200 feet above the canyon floor, buried beneath 6 inches of loose snow she had packed over herself by hand during the final hour of darkness. The snow covered the ghillie fringe sewn into her suit. It covered the wrapped barrel of her rifle. It covered everything except 2 inches of optical glass, angled with extreme care toward the valley below. She had been in that position for 4 hours. She had not moved her legs. She had not coughed. She had breathed through her nose in short, measured pulls, the exhaled vapor directed downward into the fabric of her hood so it would not ghost upward and catch the light. She was 22 years old. She had been in the field for 11 days. This was her first real engagement. Below her, 6 men moved through the snow. They moved well. Spread formation, staggered spacing, each man covering the other's blind angle. Their gear was professional. Their discipline was unmistakable. They had done this before many times, and they carried that experience in the economy of their movements, in the way they paused, scanned, moved again without waste. They were hunting her. Leah watched them through her scope. She did not feel fear exactly. Fear implied uncertainty about the outcome. What she felt was something quieter and more precise, the awareness that a single error, in any direction, would end her inside of a heartbeat. She exhaled slowly. The canyon walls rose on both sides, 150 feet of layered granite, rough and irregular, shaped by 10,000 years of freeze-thaw cycles into something like the inside of a broken cathedral. Every surface faced a different angle. Every face of rock was a different distance from every other. She had spent the last 4 hours listening to this place. She had learned one thing above all else. Sound in Canyon Frostfall did not travel in straight lines. It bent. It bounced. It arrived from directions that had nothing to do with where it originated. A stone dropped near the eastern wall echoed first from the west, then from above, then from a point downstream so distant the echo arrived 3 full seconds after the original sound. The men below did not know this yet. They would learn. 18 hours earlier, Leah Weston had been sitting in the back of a transport vehicle with 7 other soldiers, listening to the mission brief for the 3rd time. Canyon Frostfall. A 9-kilometer stretch of high-altitude terrain in the northern mountain range, accessible by 2 passes that closed with the first heavy snow and did not reopen until April. The canyon itself was classified as non-navigable by standard doctrine, too narrow for vehicle movement, too exposed for conventional troop deployment, too acoustically unpredictable for reliable radio communication. Intelligence had identified a sniper operating in the canyon. Unknown affiliation, unknown equipment. Known results: 3 reconnaissance soldiers in 31 hours, each killed at extreme range. No witnesses, no recovered shell casings, no usable sight lines for counter-investigation. The unit briefing officer was a lean man named Lieutenant Graves, who spoke with the specific flatness of someone who had briefed too many operations that had not gone as planned. 3 shooters down in the last day and a half, Graves said. Command has authorized a counter-sniper response. You go in. You locate the target. You neutralize. He paused. The canyon's acoustic environment is unusual. Standard ranging equipment may give unreliable readings. Nobody asked what unusual meant. In Leah's experience, when a briefing officer used that word, the honest translation was, "We don't fully understand it, and we're not going to tell you that directly." Leah had been assigned as a support element secondary shooter, low priority tasking. The primary team was led by Captain Douglas Harker. Harker was 41 years old and had 14 confirmed long-range kills across 3 separate operational theaters. He was not tall, but gave the impression of height anyway, through the way he occupied a room with the particular stillness of someone who has spent years practicing the discipline of not moving unnecessarily. He had gray eyes and short gray hair, and a habit of looking at things as if he were calculating their distance. He spoke rarely, and when he did, he said exactly what he meant, without decoration and without ambiguity. Leah had watched him during the briefing and noticed that Harker asked no questions. Not because he already knew the answers, but because his face showed the particular look of someone who has accepted the incompleteness of available information and has decided to proceed anyway. His spotter was Sergeant First Class Warren Niles, a broad, deliberate man who had worked with Harker for 6 years. They communicated in fragments, half-sentences, shorthand built from thousands of hours of shared silence. Watching them was like watching two people speak a language that had evolved specifically to exclude everyone else. The sensor specialist was Corporal Dennis Ruiz, 28, nervous energy under tight control, responsible for the acoustic detection array, a portable suite of directional microphones and signal processing equipment designed to triangulate the origin point of a gunshot within 30 meters. He had explained the device twice during the transit to the insertion point. He clearly loved it. He had spoken about it with the careful enthusiasm of someone describing a particularly reliable friend. 3 additional riflemen rounded out the team. Preston Webb, whose hands never seemed to stop moving. Marcus Flood, the oldest at 34, carrying the quiet resignation of a man who has accepted that his profession requires him to operate in places no reasonable person would choose to be. And Carter Baines, barely 20, who had not yet learned to hide the fact that he was nervous. Leah had recognized herself in Baines and found the recognition uncomfortable. Leah made 6. She was told to cover the north approach and hold position unless directed otherwise. She did not argue. She was the rookie. That was the arrangement. The insertion was cold and without incident. They entered the canyon from the southern pass at 0300 hours, moving by starlight, each soldier placing their feet in the tracks of the one ahead. The temperature was -14. The canyon amplified the cold the way it amplified everything else, gathered it up, reflected it back, made it feel like a presence rather than a condition. By 0500, Leah had reached her assigned position on the north ledge. She settled in. She built her snow cover by hand, working slowly, making no sound. She started listening. The other 6 men set up across 3 positions on the valley floor and the lower slopes, a standard inverted triangle formation designed to cover all likely approach angles. At 0620, Leah heard something the others did not. A sound from the eastern wall. Not a footstep, not quite, more like the whisper of weight shifting on snow-covered rock, the particular compression sound that happens when someone adjusts their position after lying still for too long. She moved her scope to the eastern face. There, 700 meters. A shadow against the rock that was wrong, too smooth, too purposeful in its stillness, different from the texture of the stone around it. She reached for her radio. Static. She adjusted the frequency. More static. The canyon walls were eating the signal. She tried twice more. Nothing. Below her, on the valley floor, the 6 men of the primary team continued moving. They had not seen what she had seen. They were sweeping toward the western wall, following a track pattern that would take them directly across the open floor exposed, predictable, their backs to the east for the next 400 meters. Leah made a decision. She did not announce it. There was no one to announce it to. She stayed on the north ledge, repositioned her scope to maintain sight on the eastern shadow, and waited. The eastern shadow did not move for 11 minutes. Leah used that time. She had learned something in the months of training that most of her classmates had treated as a theoretical footnote. A shooter's environment is a weapon, and the first task in any engagement is to understand the weapon you have been given. She had been listening to Canyon Frostfall for hours. Now, she began to analyze what she had heard. She picked up a pebble palm-sized, angular, and dropped it off the ledge to her left. Listened. The primary impact sound came back from the eastern wall first, then the western, then from somewhere downstream to the south, each echo arriving at a slightly different pitch, slightly different volume. 3 reflections. 2.5 seconds total cascade. She found a second pebble. Dropped it from her right side, closer to the canyon center. Different cascade entirely. The eastern reflection arrived first again, but weaker. The western stronger, the downstream echo suppressed. She noted the pattern. The canyon was not symmetric. The eastern wall was taller and more vertical, a harder reflective surface, like the smooth face of a bell. The western wall was lower and broken by a series of natural ledges that scattered rather than focused the returning sound, the way a rough cloth absorbs light rather than reflecting it. Any shot fired from the eastern face would produce a reflection pattern that the instruments on the valley floor would read as originating from the west. Not because the instruments were poorly designed, because the canyon was deliberately misleading, had been misleading every sound that had ever traveled through it, had been doing this for geological ages without any awareness of how useful it would one day prove to be. She confirmed this with a third experiment. A careful crack of two stones struck together. Sharp, brief. She watched through her scope as Ruiz, 400 meters below, turned his directional microphone array toward the western wall. Leah did not allow herself to feel satisfaction. Satisfaction was a distraction. She noted the information and filed it. The eastern shadow moved. It resolved itself, slowly, into the shape of a prone shooter. Leah could see the line of a rifle barrel emerging from a ghillie-draped form. The shooter had selected a natural shelf in the rock, a position with excellent sightlines to the valley floor and almost no exposure from below. Good position, expertly chosen. This was not someone who had wandered into the canyon with a rifle. This was someone who had studied the terrain, who had taken time to identify lines of fire and angles of concealment, who had approached this task with the same patient methodology that Leah was applying from the opposite direction. But the shooter was looking down. He was not looking at the north ledge. He was watching Harker's team moving across the valley floor, 400 meters below, unaware. Leah's breathing slowed without deliberate effort. The scope reticle settled. The wind had dropped to nearly nothing, a rare stillness in the canyon, perhaps 30 seconds, perhaps less. These moments of stillness came irregularly, lasted briefly, and could not be predicted beyond a few seconds in advance. You had to be ready before they arrived, because they would not wait. 740 meters, downward angle of approximately 20 degrees, wind negligible, temperature -14, which would cause a slight bullet drop variance she had memorized from her ballistic tables. She made 3 adjustments to her scope turrets, precise, deliberate, each click a known value. Then she waited. Not for courage, she had no particular shortage of that. She waited because the cold barrel needed one more careful breath of stability before the shot, a thing her instructor had drilled into her so many times it had become automatic. The eastern shadow shifted slightly. The rifle barrel angled toward Marcus Flood, who was moving across open ground. Oblivious. Leah fired. The suppressor, a heavy tube of machined aluminum and baffled steel, reduced the muzzle blast to something like a firm hand clap, not silent. Nothing is truly silent, but quiet enough, in the ambient noise of wind and stone, to be ambiguous. The shot struck. The eastern shooter folded without drama, the way a sleeping person slumps when the last bit of tension leaves their muscles. And from the western wall, filling the canyon, the echo arrived sharp, declarative, coming from entirely the wrong direction. On the valley floor, all 5 surviving members of Harker's team went to ground, rifles swinging west. Harker's voice clipped an immediate, "Contact west, sniper, all elements down." They dropped, all 5 of them, into snow, into any available depression in the ground. Good reaction, fast, faster than Leah had expected, and she had expected fast. Niles, the spotter, was scanning the western wall through his scope within 4 seconds of the shot. Ruiz had his acoustic array repositioned in under 10. Webb, Flood, and Baines formed a loose defensive line facing west, rifles trained on the broken ledges of the lower wall. Leah watched all of this from the north ledge, perfectly still. She had approximately 90 seconds before the tactical picture stabilized and they began a systematic search. Once Harker settled his team into a proper counter-sniper protocol, triangulation, movement suppression, methodical sector-by-sector elimination, the geometry of the canyon would eventually produce an answer. Not the right answer, but an answer that would send them in a specific direction. She needed to control which direction. She reached into the pocket of her suit and withdrew a small collection of items she had gathered during the previous hours. 3 spent brass casings from her earlier training shots, a short length of paracord, and a flat piece of stone roughly the size of a playing card. She had not known exactly how she would use them. She had known she would use them. She fixed the stone to the paracord. She placed the brass casings in her left palm. Below, she could hear Harker's commands, not the words, but the cadence. Order, counter-order, a pause. The particular silence of a team leader who is reconsidering. That echo was off, Niles said. Leah was close enough, the canyon quiet enough, to hear individual words when the wind cooperated. Came in too fast from the west. Reflection, maybe. Ruiz, Harker said. Give me a reading. The pause, while Ruiz consulted his array, was perhaps 12 seconds. Array puts origin point at 200 to 250 meters. Western wall, elevation 0. Ruiz's voice. Careful. But the cascade pattern is. I'm getting interference. The wall geometry is producing secondary reflections I can't fully isolate. Best guess? Western wall, low elevation. But I'm not confident. Not confident. That was a word Leah could work with. She tossed the stone on its paracord, a slow, underhand arc that sent it skipping across the far edge of the ledge, clattering down the rock face to her left, producing a sharp series of impacts that cascaded off the eastern wall and arrived below as something that sounded nothing like a falling stone. It sounded like movement, purposeful movement, coming from the north. Flood spun. North wall, something moving. Hold, Harker said immediately. Don't fire. Leah went completely still again. 30 seconds. A minute. The wind picked up, erasing everything. Harker, that was not a shot. Niles, no. But it could have been repositioning. Harker, maybe. 2 possible origin points now. West wall, low elevation. North wall, upper. A pause. Harker again, quieter. Webb, flood, cover west. Baines, watch north. Ruiz, keep that array running. Then, to no one in particular, barely audible, how many of them are up there? Leah counted silently. 5 targets. Harker's team, professional soldiers in a defensive configuration on the valley floor, covering 2 walls. They had lost their target identification. They did not know if they were facing one shooter or multiple. They did not know what the canyon was doing to their instruments. Their uncertainty was her first real asset. She began to plan her second shot. Harker did not stay defensive for long. That was his nature. Leah could read it even from 400 meters, even through glass. The man was not built for waiting. Waiting, in Harker's calculus, meant ceding control of the engagement to whoever was doing the shooting. He had survived 14 years in the field by refusing to cede that control, and he was not going to start now. We're moving, Harker said. Bounding, 3 and 2. Flood, you and Webb hold position, cover east and north. Baines, you're with me and Niles. We go to the western wall, set up elevated, and find the angle. Leah processed this quickly. The western wall at elevation would give Harker a sight line to most of the eastern face and portions of the north ledge. Not all of it. The overhang above Leah's current position was a dead angle from the west, but enough. If Harker reached elevation, the geometry shifted. Leah would need to move. She could not move until they were moving. She waited. She watched Harker, Niles, and Baines begin their bound to the western wall, short rushes, 1 man moving while 2 covered. The remaining 2, Flood and Webb, set up in prone positions in the valley floor depression, rifles angled outward. The spacing between Harker's group and Flood Webb was growing. When it reached 150 meters, Leah moved. She did not stand. She slid backward on her elbows and knees, keeping her profile below the ledge lip, moving at the speed of patience. The speed that does not disturb snow, does not scatter loose gravel, does not produce sound. It was not a natural speed for a human body. Everything about the human body wanted to move faster, wanted to get up, wanted to find somewhere warmer and less exposed. Training was the practice of overruling that want, of teaching the body that patience was the more survivable reflex. 20 meters back along the ledge, the rock face angled inward, creating a small concave recess in the cliff. Leah had identified it 4 hours earlier. She settled into it, re-established her snow cover from the material she had thought to carry in a small drawstring bag, and rebuilt her firing position. New angle. New sight lines. The valley floor was now visible from a different vector. She listened. Ruiz, from his position near the valley center, was speaking into his headset. The wind had shifted slightly, and his voice carried upward with unusual clarity. Harker, I'm getting a new echo pattern. The last sound from the north wall, I ran it back through the processor. It's not consistent with a shooter at north elevation. The frequency envelope is wrong. A pause. Harker, from somewhere on the lower western slope, what is it consistent with? Thrown object. Stone or metal. But here's the thing. The origin point calculates to the ledge system at north upper, 215 to 240 meters elevation. Silence. Then Harker. She moved something to make noise. She's up there and she moved something to draw our attention. Another pause, this one longer. She knows how the echo works. Leah felt something cold in her chest. That was not the temperature. Harker had just described her own method back to her. The man had taken a single data point, the frequency envelope of a thrown object, and correctly extrapolated the intent behind it. That was not luck. That was the product of a mind that had been doing this for a very long time, that had stored 10,000 operational memories and was running pattern recognition on them at speed. She was going to have to move faster than she had planned. She shifted her scope. Flood and Webb were still in their prone positions, covering 2 wide arcs. Good cover, hard targets. But their attention was outward. Watching the walls, they were not watching the north ledge directly. There was a gap in their coverage pattern, a narrow dead zone created by the angle of the valley and the height of the snow berms they had crawled behind. Leah measured it carefully. She had one shot before that gap closed. She took it. The suppressor muffled the report. The echo arrived from the south, this time an entirely new direction, courtesy of a natural rock chimney Leah had mapped earlier. Preston Webb went still in the snow. Flood's head whipped south. He started shooting at empty rock. Canyon Frostfall swallowed the sound and gave it back different. 3 down, 3 left. Harker knew. Not everything, but enough. Leah could hear it in the cadence of the command sharper now, stripped of the assumption of numerical advantage. He was no longer hunting a sniper. He was managing an emergency. Ruiz, get to cover. Leave the array running. Patch the feed to my earpiece, but get yourself behind rock. Now, a pause. Flood, stop shooting. You are wasting ammunition and marking your position. Silence. Then, carefully. This is one shooter. Niles, how do you know? Because the shots are not simultaneous. They're sequential. She's moving between positions and using the canyon to confuse origin point. We have 3 down because we've been reacting to echoes instead of shots. A pause. Long enough for the implication to settle. She played us. Leah, pressed into her rock recess, found herself experiencing something unexpected, a specific and complicated respect for Douglas Harker. The man had just done in minutes what should have taken much longer. He had stripped away every wrong assumption his team had made and arrived at the structural truth of the engagement. One shooter. Moving. Using acoustics deliberately. That was the moment Leah understood that the second half of this engagement was going to be completely different from the first. She had neutralized 3 men by exploiting their confusion. Harker was no longer confused. She needed a new approach. She needed to create a problem that even a clear-eyed opponent could not solve quickly. She pulled the spent brass casings from her pocket and studied them. She had 3. She set 2 aside. The third she examined against the rock, estimating trajectory, estimating the bounce pattern of the eastern wall if it struck at a specific angle. She threw it hard, sidearm, aimed not at the valley floor, but at the eastern wall itself, 40 meters from her position, at a joint in the rock where 2 faces met at roughly 90 degrees. The casing hit the joint and fragmented into 3 distinct ricochets, each one producing a separate small sound. The eastern wall sent the primary reflection down into the valley. The secondary and tertiary ricochets went upstream, northeast, an entirely different direction. Below, Ruiz's voice. Harker, I've got weight. I've got 3 separate impact points. The acoustic signature is showing 3 different origin points, all firing within a half-second window. Harker, very carefully. That is not possible. I know. A long pause. Then Harker, she's bouncing something off the walls, not shots. Objects. She's feeding false data into the array. Niles quietly. Can she do that? She just did. Another silence. This one different in quality, heavier. Leah recognized it. It was the silence of a man who has just accepted that the fight he thought he was in is not the fight he is actually in. Harker spoke again, very quietly, and Leah had to strain to catch it over the wind. "Ruiz, shut off the array." "But..." "Shut it off. It's giving her more information than it's giving us. She knows what it measures and she's using it against us. We go back to eyes only. Natural tracking, wind, footprints, position logic." The array went dark. Leah pressed her back against the rock and thought carefully. The instrument had been an asset. Now it was gone. She had one brass casing left. 3 targets: Harker, Niles, and Ruiz. Harker was somewhere on the western lower slope. Ruiz and Niles were in the valley center, behind cover. She began to move again, slowly, patiently. The way the canyon itself moved in geological time, in increments too small to see directly, but producing large changes over long distances. She had learned in 4 hours of stillness what the canyon sounded like when it was undisturbed. She was going to move through it now, and the discipline of that movement was to add nothing to what the canyon would sound like on its own. No additional information, no new signals, nothing that would enter the acoustic record of the place and be cataloged by the careful mind of Douglas Harker. The storm arrived without significant warning. A wall of white from the north, past the kind of weather that forms fast at altitude, that gathers itself in a narrow band of unstable air and releases everything at once. Visibility dropped from 300 meters to 40 in under 2 minutes. The temperature fell another 7 degrees. The wind went from manageable to structural, a force that leaned on things rather than merely blowing. Leah pressed herself flat. In poor visibility, movement was death. Movement created sound and shape in a storm were all a careful observer needed. She had been taught that the instinct to retreat from bad weather was wrong in a storm. A still woman was invisible. A moving woman was a target. She lay still and listened. The canyon's acoustics changed completely in the storm. The ambient noise, billions of snowflakes striking billions of surfaces simultaneously, created a broadband background hiss that swallowed the reflection she had been relying on. Her own tricks would not work in this. A thrown stone would be inaudible at 40 meters. But neither would a footstep. She heard it anyway. Not a footstep exactly. A change in the ambient frequency from her left, a narrow band disruption in the hiss pattern, repeated at irregular intervals. Someone moving through snow, moving carefully, moving with the deliberate measured pace of a trained tracker following a logical deduction rather than a clear sign. Harker. He was climbing, not up the western wall. He had abandoned that plan when the geometry shifted. He was moving along the valley floor toward the northern base of the canyon, working his way toward the bottom of the north ledge system, the base of the cliff face below Leah's position. He was going to climb. Leah ran the logic through. If Harker reached the base and climbed even 50 feet, he would reach an angle from which the north ledge overhang became visible. He would see Leah's position, or at minimum, he would see the disturbance in the snow where Leah had been, and that would be enough. Snow held information the way paper held writing. Every shift, every impression, every compressed crystal pattern told a story to someone who knew how to read it. 2 options. Move now, in the storm. With Harker already close to the base, high risk of noise, high risk of visual contact at close range. Or wait and force Harker to come to her. Leah thought about this. For a precise number of seconds, she counted them and made her choice. She reached into her pack and removed the last piece of equipment she had been saving. A small length of comm wire, stiff with cold, attached to a spring-loaded metal clip. She had improvised it during the insertion, winding the wire around a section of paracord, creating something that would, when released from tension, snap against the rock with a sharp, localized sound. She positioned it at the very edge of her snow cover, angled toward the eastern face, set the spring, left it. Then she moved not away, but laterally, 12 feet to the right, into a narrow crack in the cliff face that offered partial concealment. She repositioned her rifle. She cleared snow from her scope with one careful breath. She waited. 3 minutes later, from the valley floor directly below, Carter Baines, who was supposed to be maintaining a defensive position near the valley center, made the mistake of firing at a shadow he thought he had seen moving on the western wall. 2 shots, semi-automatic, muzzle flash in the storm. Everything happened at once. Leah saw the muzzle flash. Her training answered before her conscious mind could. The shot was reflex and calculation simultaneously, a thing she had done 10,000 times in practice and twice in the preceding hours. The canyon swallowed the sound and returned it as chaos. Baines went down. 2 left. Harker and Niles. From below, very close, she heard Harker's voice stripped now of all command cadence, just a sound a person makes when something bad happens to someone they have spent years working beside. "Niles, where are you?" A pause. "Here." Niles's voice, from the east. "I'm here, not hit." Then silence. In the storm, 2 professionals processed the information that they were the only 2 left. The storm peaked and held for 40 minutes. During those 40 minutes, nothing moved in Canyon Frostfall. Not Leah, not Harker, not Niles. The snow came down in sheets, driven horizontal by the wind, erasing footprints as fast as they were made, reducing the world to a radius of 40 feet in every direction. Leah used the time to think about Douglas Harker. She thought about the decisions Harker had made in the last 2 hours, the speed with which he had identified the acoustic deception, the discipline with which he had pulled his team back from reactive behavior and reimposed methodical thinking, the order to shut down the array that won in particular. A lesser commander would have kept the instrument running, continued trusting its readings, because shutting it off required accepting that the tool was being used against you. That was a psychologically difficult admission to make in the middle of an active engagement. Harker had made it inside of 30 seconds. That told Leah something important about how Harker would approach the final problem. He would not panic. He would not rush. He would take the time to work out the geometry of Leah's position from first principles, from what he knew about bullet angles, wind direction, canyon structure, and the logic of where a single shooter would need to be to achieve what had already been achieved. He would build the problem the way an engineer builds a structure, laying each piece on the one before it, checking each assumption before proceeding to the next. He would solve for it like a problem, and he would get close. The question was not whether Harker would figure it out. Given enough time, he would. The question was whether Leah could act before that figuring out became lethal. The storm began to thin. The horizontal drive of the snow softened to a more vertical fall. Visibility opened 40 feet, then 80, then 150. Leah heard Harker speak to Niles. "She's on the north ledge. Upper system, between the overhang and the concave section, probably shifted position twice, once after the first shot, once after the fourth. She's moving laterally, not vertically. She doesn't want to climb or descend because that generates noise and leaves vertical tracks in the snow that stand out from the horizontal drift pattern." "Niles, you've been working this out." "She's been 3 positions. Triangulating backwards from the shot angles gives me a lateral range of roughly 30 meters. The overhang limits her upper position, the ledge lip limits her lower. She's somewhere in a box, about 30 meters wide, 10 meters deep, starting 60 meters east of the north entrance chimney." Silence. Then Niles, "That's still a big box." "Yes, but it's a finite box." A pause. "And she knows I just defined it." Leah went very still. Because Harker was right. She was operating inside a box. And she had just heard Harker define that box precisely, which meant Harker was close enough for his voice to carry clearly, which meant Harker was not on the valley floor anymore. She moved her scope in careful increments, scanning the lower cliff face below her position. There, 45 feet below and 30 meters to her left, partially sheltered by a diagonal crack in the rock face, Douglas Harker, not moving. Set up in a solid firing position, back braced against the canyon wall, rifle angled upward at approximately 40 degrees. He was scanning the north ledge systematically, working right to left, one sector at a time. The scope of his rifle moved in small, precise increments, pausing at each sector for 3 to 4 seconds before advancing. The movement was unhurried. It communicated certainty, not the certainty of a man who already knows where his target is, but the certainty of a man who knows that if he proceeds correctly, he will find what he is looking for. He had not reached Leah's sector yet. He would reach it in perhaps 2 minutes. Leah lay completely still and thought about the last brass casing in her pocket. It was not a fair fight. Leah understood this clearly and without sentiment. Harker was a better shooter. Harker had more experience, more confirmed kills, more hours in positions like this one. If this came down to a pure exchange of fire, two people acquiring the same target simultaneously, trigger time the deciding factor, Harker would win. The probability distribution was not even close. So it could not come down to that. Leah had one advantage, a single, specific advantage that she had spent the last 2 hours creating. Harker knew approximately where she was, but not precisely. Harker was scanning a box. Inside that box, Leah had one place of concealment that Harker had not yet visually cleared. The lateral crack to her right, narrow, uncomfortable, offering only partial concealment, was in the final sector of Harker's scan pattern. He would reach it last. If Leah moved to it now, she would generate sound. If she stayed in her current position, Harker would reach her sector in less than 2 minutes and acquire her directly. She had a third option. She looked at the last brass casing in her palm, smooth metal, warm from body heat. She looked at the rock chimney 4 meters above, and to her left, the natural stack that had been channeling wind and amplifying it all morning, turning a moderate breeze into a focused column of moving air that whistled against certain edges with a sound like a distant bow drawn across a string. She looked at where Harker was positioned. She looked at the angle of the cliff face between them. She thought about what a brass casing, thrown hard at a specific joint in the rock 12 meters to Harker's right, would sound like when it struck and ricocheted in 3 fast sequences against the wall surfaces inside that chimney. It would sound, in the amplified acoustics of the confined space, like someone moving directly above. It would sound like a sniper who had made a mistake. It would draw Harker's eyes upward and to the right for a specific interval not long, a second and a half, perhaps 2, but enough. The variables were brutal. She would need to throw the casing hard enough to reach the chimney joint, a 15-meter toss, aimed precisely, with her offhand because her firing hand was already on the rifle. She would need to fire in the window created by the sound, before Harker processed the deception and corrected. She would need to hold her position through all of this without shifting her body enough to disturb the snow cover and create a visual tell. She closed her eyes for exactly 3 seconds. Not to pray, not from fear. To run the sequence one final time, in order, with no mistakes. She opened them. Her left arm drew back. Below, Harker's scope was 2 sectors from her position. 1 sector. Leah threw the casing. It arced through the cold air, a small silver comma against gray stone, and struck the chimney joint with a sharp crack. The chimney caught it and threw it back in 3 fast ricochets, each one amplified, each one arriving from a slightly different direction. The combined sound was unmistakable, urgent, close, human in its irregularity. The kind of sound that triggers a trained response in a trained person before the conscious mind has time to evaluate whether the response is warranted. Harker's scope swung up and right. The interval was 1.8 seconds by Leah's internal count. She fired at 1.2. The shot was clean. Captain Douglas Harker, 14 confirmed kills, 41 years old. 20 years in the field, folded against the rock face and did not move. Canyon Frostfall went quiet. Leah did not move for a long time. Niles was the last. He was somewhere on the valley floor, and he had heard the shot, and he knew what it meant. Leah heard him moving, not panicked movement, not flight, controlled movement, a man going to ground, finding cover, making himself small. Niles had been in the field long enough to know that running was death, and that the only option left to him was to wait and see. Leah understood him. She did not enjoy this part. There was no good way to frame what came next, no tactical framing that changed its essential nature. Niles was a professional doing his job. He was trained, experienced, and had made no errors. He had simply been assigned to a team that encountered a set of conditions it was not prepared for, and those conditions had eroded the team one by one until only he remained. That was not justice. It was not judgment. It was geometry. Leah worked it methodically. She identified Niles's position from the movement pattern, a long depression in the valley floor, a natural berm that ran north to south, offering good cover on 3 sides. Niles had his back to the south wall and was covering north and east. Reasonable choice. The correct choice, given what he knew. What he did not know was that the berm had a gap in it. Leah had noted the gap 4 hours ago. A natural drainage channel cut through the berm at its midpoint. A slot perhaps 18 inches wide at ground level, invisible from any position except the north ledge at upper elevation. From anywhere else in the canyon, it looked like a solid berm. From Leah's position, it was a window. Niles had chosen cover that was not as complete as it appeared. He had made the only error available to him, the error of trusting the visible terrain without being able to verify the angle from above. The shot took 4 minutes to set up, not because the distance was extreme. 900 meters achievable, within her certified range, but the drainage slot was narrow, and the angle was demanding, and the post-storm wind had resumed with an irregular pulse, gusting every 40 to 50 seconds from a slightly different direction. She needed to know the wind's pattern precisely before she committed. She had learned in training that patience before the shot was not delay, it was investment. A patient shot landed. A rushed shot was a gamble, and in a position like this one, there were no second chances. She waited for 4 full cycles of the gust pattern. On the 5th cycle, in the 3-second lull before the gust resumed, she fired. The sound went down into the canyon and came back changed, as everything did in this place multiplied, scattered, arriving from several directions at once, as if the mountain itself was describing what had happened. Then, silence. True silence. Not the held breath silence of a position waiting to be discovered. Not the tactical silence of men communicating without words. The silence of a place that had discharged its function and was returning to its natural state. The snow fell slowly in the post-storm air. Canyon Frostfall was empty of everything except wind and stone and cold. Leah Weston did not move for a long time. She lay in the narrow crack in the north ledge and stared at the gray sky above the canyon rim and let the cold work through her suit into her skin. Let it become the primary sensation, displacing everything else. The cold was honest. It asked nothing. It simply was what it was. She did not feel like a legend. She did not feel like a ghost. She felt like a 22-year-old, lying in a crack, in a rock in the freezing cold, who had just made the worst morning of her life into something she was going to be required to report in precise detail to a chain of command that had not been reachable for the last 6 hours. She was also very hungry. Her radio had regained partial signal 20 minutes ago, the storm's interference clearing as the weather moved south, and she had been leaving it alone, letting the receiver collect traffic, not transmitting. She listened to the channel for another 10 minutes before she keyed the send button. This is Weston. North position, canyon interior. Radio was down since insertion. A pause. Long enough that she checked the frequency setting. Then, a voice, Major Eugene Strickler, the Operations Center Duty Watch Commander. Weston, what is your status? Operational. No casualties on my end. Another pause. We've been trying to reach the primary team for 2 hours. What's Harker's status? She told them. She kept it brief. Engagement initiated, 6 hostiles, neutralized, primary team casualties, method of engagement. She used the standard reporting format and did not embellish. The silence on the other end stretched to 20 seconds. Strickler, very carefully. Weston, you are confirming 6 KIA counter-sniper team all elements. You are reporting this as a solo engagement. Yes, sir. Another long pause. The primary team had Captain Harker. Yes, sir, I'm aware. The line was quiet. Leah could hear ambient noise from the operations center in the background, the sound of a room full of people who had stopped what they were doing to listen to a radio channel. Corporal Weston, how? It was not a question exactly. It was the sound a person makes when the information they have just received does not fit any existing category. Leah was quiet for a moment. She looked out over the canyon. The snow had stopped entirely. The late morning light was coming in at a low angle, striking the eastern wall and throwing long shadows across the valley floor. The canyon was beautiful in an indifferent way, the beauty of a place that does not care whether you notice it or not. That will be the same place tomorrow whether you are alive to see it or not. The canyon, sir. The acoustics. Every surface reflects differently. You can use that. Static. Then, you use the sound. The sound works both ways. They were using instruments designed to locate origin points. I gave the instruments false data. Once they shut off the instruments, I had to work faster. But by then, she paused. By then, there were fewer of them. Another silence. Weston, stay in position. We are sending extraction. Estimated arrival 4 hours. Understood. And Weston. Seer. Don't move. Don't do anything. Just wait there. She had the sense that the instruction meant more than its literal content. That it was the kind of thing you said to someone after they have done something you have not processed, yet hold still while we figure out what category to put you in. Yes, sir, Leah said. I'll be here. She set the radio down. She turned over onto her back and looked up at the sky. A high-altitude overcast, uniform and pale, the color of old bone. No wind now, no snow. Just cold and silence, and the last few hours of a day that had been longer than she had expected any single day to be. She thought about the 6 men below. She thought about Harker in particular, the speed of his analysis, the discipline of his corrections, the methodical precision with which he had been climbing toward the answer. In a different canyon, on a different morning, with different acoustics, the outcome would have been reversed. That was not a comfortable thing to contemplate, but it was a true thing. And Leah had found that true things, even uncomfortable ones, were better company than false reassurances. Canyon Frostfall was quiet. The sound the wind made as it came in from the northern pass was long and low and old. The sound of a place that had been here before anyone with a rifle, before anyone with a name, before anyone at all. It did not acknowledge what had happened in it today. It did not need to. Leah pulled her snow cover tighter and watched the sky. In 4 hours, a helicopter would come over the southern rim, and someone would call her name, and she would stand up and be a person again, rather than a position in a rock face. She would drink hot coffee from a thermos and be cold and tired and hungry in the uncomplicated way that is just biology and not anything else. But for now, she was still here. In the canyon. In the silence between echoes. Where a girl had come in and something else, not quite a ghost but not entirely a person either, had learned to listen. The after-action report took 6 hours to write. Major Strickler reviewed it twice. He sent it up the chain without comment, which was itself a kind of comment. The chain reviewed it and sent it back down with a single annotation. Confirmed. That was all. Leah was promoted. The ceremony was brief and attended by people who looked at her in a way she recognized. The way you look at something that you understand technically but cannot quite believe. The way you look at a photograph of a place that seems too extreme to be real landscape and too detailed to be invented. They shook her hand. They said correct things. She said correct things back. Nobody said what was actually in the room, which was a kind of collective adjustment of the framework by which people in that building understood what was possible and what was not. She shook hands. She said the correct words. She accepted the correct paperwork. A month later, she was assigned to an instructor position at a training facility in the Northern Highlands. The official reason given was operational continuity and knowledge transfer. The unofficial reason, which she understood from a conversation with a senior NCO who had known her since basic training, was somewhat different. They want you explaining how you did it, the NCO told her. They want 10 more soldiers who can do what you did. What I did was specific, Leah said. It was one canyon, one set of conditions. That's what they want to understand. How to read conditions. How to use them. She thought about this for a long time. She thought about Harker, who had understood faster than anyone should have been able to, and who had not been fast enough. She thought about Ruiz, shutting down the acoustic array on command without argument. She thought about Niles, choosing cover that was 95% effective and relying on the 5% gap that Leah had spent 4 hours mapping. She thought about what the canyon had taught her. The world is never silent. In silence, the world is loudest. Every surface is speaking, all the time. And what it is saying is, here is where I am, here is what I am made of, here is the angle at which sound strikes me, and here is how I send it back. Most people do not listen. Most people hear only what they are expecting to hear, from the direction they are expecting to hear it. In Frostfall, she had listened to what was actually there. That was all. That was everything. She sat down at the instructor's desk on her first day and looked at the 12 faces of the students assigned to her. Young faces, some nervous, some trying not to look nervous, one in the back, already looking at the window, already somewhere else in his head. Leah recognized the type. She had been that type. She had been the one in the back with her attention somewhere else, until the day the somewhere else had suddenly become somewhere very specific, very cold, and very consequential. "Before we talk about rifles," Leah said, "we're going to talk about listening." A few of them blinked. Not radio, not intelligence, not what other people tell you is there. Listening to the actual environment you're in. What it sounds like, how sound moves through it, what it does to a shot, what it does to your instruments, what it does to you. She paused, because the place you're in is never neutral. It's always either working for you or against you, and the difference between those two outcomes is whether you bothered to understand it before the shooting started. She let that sit. Outside the window, winter was beginning, not the extreme cold of the high canyon, but the ordinary cold of the lowlands, gray and damp and persistent. Somewhere north of here, past 3 mountain passes and 2 days of travel, Canyon Frostfall was filling with new snow, burying whatever evidence remained of that morning, filling with silence, filling with echoes that had nothing left to carry. One of the students raised his hand, a young man named Daniel Vance, with a precise, contained manner that reminded her obliquely of what she imagined herself to look like before Frostfall. "How do you learn to listen like that?" he asked. "Is it practice, or is it instinct?" Leah considered the question seriously, the way it deserved. "It's practice," she said, "until it becomes instinct. And then you stop knowing the difference." She opened the training manual to Chapter 1. Then she closed it again. She had decided, somewhere during the long helicopter ride down from the mountains, that she was not going to teach from the manual. The manual had its uses. It codified baseline knowledge, gave students a shared vocabulary, established the structural minimum they needed before they could begin to develop actual judgment. But the manual could not teach what she most needed to teach, because what she most needed to teach could not be written down in a way that survived the translation from experienced to inexperienced. It had to be discovered. It had to be arrived at through the specific experience of sitting in a cold place for a long time and noticing what the world was doing around you. She could not give them Canyon Frostfall, but she could give them the habit of attention that Frostfall had forced on her. She could give them exercises designed to strip away the noise of their own preconceptions and make them simply listen. Sit in a room for an hour without speaking and count the sounds. Identify the direction of a sound without turning toward it. Describe the acoustic difference between a space you can see and a space you cannot. Small exercises, humble ones, nothing that looked like what they imagined training to be. She knew from her own experience that the students who took these exercises seriously would be recognizable later in debriefs, in after-action reviews, in the way they described their engagements. They would use words like, "The canyon was telling me," or "the terrain was wrong," or "I listened to the position before I moved." They would sound, to people who had not been through the same process, slightly mystical, slightly strange. They would not be mystical. They would simply be paying attention. Outside, the wind picked up. Somewhere distant, a door closed against it. The sound arrived in the classroom a moment later, softened, reshaped, arriving from a direction that had nothing to do with the door. Daniel Vance, in the front row, turned his head slightly toward the sound, not toward the window, toward the direction the sound had arrived from. He had heard the difference. Leah said nothing. She made a mental note. Nobody else in the room had noticed. Leah noticed. She always would. Far to the north, in a canyon filling slowly with new snow, 6 men who had been professionals and were now something more final lay still in the white. The canyon was patient with them. It was patient with everything. It had been patient with the glacier that carved it. It had been patient with the first people who had walked through it 10,000 years ago and heard their own footsteps return to them from impossible directions and perhaps thought the place was haunted. It was not haunted. It was acoustically complex. The distinction mattered enormously, and not at all. In the classroom in the lowland town, Leah Weston began to teach. Outside, the canyon waited, as it always had, full of echoes that would carry whoever came next.